A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 20. The assistant groundskeeper, Nikolai, who took care of the zoo, had requested an urgent audience with Kublitz. Immediately after lunch, he was admitted to the dank-smelling basement office with its steel desk, its safes, its shadowy lighting. Kublitz sat behind the desk, a ballpoint pen held tightly in his hand, filling in forms. There were always forms. Nikolai, in his rough clothes and heavy boots, stood until he was bidden to sit in a straight-backed gray chair facing the desk. Then he said, "About the tree." "Yes," both spoke in Russian. "The tree of which Schutz complained?" "I know of which tree you spoke." "It has been removed as ordered?" "So I assumed." "Is that all you have come to report?" "No, but please understand, Comrade Kublitz, and make clear in your report that the tree is the embassy's responsibility. Like Kublitz, who had his superior officer, Nikolai was not a member of the embassy staff. They, along with Dr. Schutz and Georg Wolter, were the only ones in the Villa Petrograd who were not. They were a group apart. Only grudgingly, on instructions from Moscow, had the ambassador allowed this small company from the KGB to occupy one corner of his rest and recreation estate. Nikolai was continuing, "The embassy ground staff are under orders to keep clear the land 5 meters outside the wall because of the proximity of the road. That side of the wall had been neglected. It should not have happened." "It is a small matter," Kublitz said, reaching for another form. "The tree has been removed. In any case, Dr. Schutz is necessarily nervous about such things." Nikolai leaned forward in his chair. He had now come to the point of his visit. "So I too believed at first, but no more. I am convinced that someone is, in fact, spying on Dr. Schutz and his work." "That is impossible. No one knows excepting ourselves of Dr. Schutz's presence here, unless, of course, you are implying carelessness in Moscow. The ambassador himself had no knowledge of the nature of our research." "That may be, but one of the embassy guards, a man named Yosef, has twice seen a stranger, obviously an outsider, in the woods near the laboratory." "How do you know this?" "He told some of the other groundskeepers. I was present." "And he did nothing?" "Yosef is a dolt. He has worked here 15 years, raking, shoveling, pruning. He thought it not important. There have been intruders in the past, he says, young boys, hunters who have scaled the wall. It is difficult to do, but not impossible. I myself might have thought this intruder innocent, perhaps merely curious, except for 2 things. "The 2 things?" Kublitz spoke impatiently. He thought that Nikolai, normally taciturn, was spinning out his tale for effect. Yosef described the man's clothing. It amused him that the intruder was wearing an odd-colored suit, covered with spots of green and brown. From his description, I recognized it immediately. It was a camouflage uniform of the American military. Such a suit is, I believe, not obtainable except from official supply depots. Also, Yosef was sure that it was the same man twice on 2 different days, both times near dawn. Surely that sounds like more than idle curiosity. "The second thing," Kublitz had now pushed his pile of forms away and was paying full attention. "The second thing I saw for myself, it was a man examining the dock in the river, the dock containing Dr. Schutz's instruments and his water valves." "Examining? In what way?" "As you know, there is an observation slot in the river grate. I looked through it by chance just in time to see the man climbing from a canoe onto the dock. I continued to watch. He had been fishing, it is true, but he looked under the dock and then reached with his arm into the water. Finally, he extracted a hook which had become caught in the dock below the surface. That means nothing. Fishermen are always entangling their hooks. Perhaps, but this one, after freeing his hook, crossed the dock and examined the other side of it as well. Having discovered the intake valve, he was obviously looking for the outflow. I am reasonably sure he found it." "What did you do?" "I opened the gate, walked to the dock, and told him to leave. He showed me the fish he had caught, said something in English which I could not understand, and left. He may have been an ordinary fisherman. There are many on the river." But Kublitz was obviously concerned. "It is possible, but an American agent would know that too. It is an easy disguise also. It is difficult to say why. He did not look like an ordinary fisherman, but like an intellectual." "Describe him." Kublitz described Fergus with reasonable accuracy while Kublitz took notes on a plain-lined pad. He laid down his pen. Comrade Nikolai, none of the things I have told you is in itself important. It is possible to obtain a camouflage suit. None of the things you have told me, you have told is in itself important. It is possible to obtain a camouflage suit. It is possible for a fisherman to be curious. But since there are 3 separate events, it may be that they are significant. I will consider the matter. Meanwhile, keep the zoo area under surveillance. Nikolai stood up. I will do what I can, he said, but you are aware that I have other duties. It was known that Nikolai did not enjoy his role as cage cleaner. I am aware. It is possible we may require additional help. He rose. The audience was ended. As soon as Nikolai had left, Kublitz turned to the telephone on his desk and dialed an unlisted number in Washington. It complicates things, said Mr. Bales. In fact, it's a pretty awful mess. It is, Fergus agreed, a lot grimmer than the old one. But is it really? Colonel Attenborough questioned. Can you get much grimmer than anthracis and corona, 2 of the worst contagions known to medicine? Medicine doesn't know the Steinkopf syndrome. Is sudden death worse than a lifetime of idiocy? It's not a question you can argue sensibly, I suppose. In any case, we have the girl to consider. She's not a Russian political prisoner in Siberia. She's a 12-year-old American child from just up the road. It makes a difference. They sat in Fergus's cabin on this chill day. They had left the trestle table spread with papers and sat at the other end of the room where logs blazed in the Fieldstone fireplace. Outside, the gray wind rattled gusts of rain against the windows, and cold rivulets ran through the trees down to the river. It makes a difference, all right, said Mr. Bales, if she's really there. There's our first problem. So far, it's just conjecture. He saw Fergus's face and added quickly, Fergus, I grant you it's convincing. It's even credible, as you say, that the Russians don't know anything about it. From what we hear, the KGB agent in charge, a man named Kublitz, stays away from the laboratory. He doesn't like germs. But we need to be surer than we are before we take any drastic action about it. And believe me, the action might have to be drastic. Also, the colonel added, if she is there, or was there, we ought to know what's happened to her. It's an unpleasant possibility, but a real one, that Dr. Schutz has finished his experiment and disposed of her. He'd have no qualms about that, and we know he has a crematorium for his chimpanzees. There's no assurance she's still alive, or that any trace of her still exists. No assurance, agreed Fergus, except that that's the whole point of Schutz's research. There's no reason at all to kill anybody. We need to get a clearer explanation of that, said Mr. Bales. Mr. Bales said, for ourselves, and for others we may have to convince. You will, said Fergus grimly. First, that order of business I phoned you about. It could turn out to be the key to the whole thing. Did you get it started? I did, Mr. Bales said. We should have the answer by tomorrow, maybe tonight. I can even give you a partial answer now. Of actual Nazi party members you'd call quite ardent in Dr. Schutz's day, but young and therefore not very prominent, there are probably a couple of hundred holding important jobs in Germany today. Important and ardent are variables, of course, and so the number depends on your definition. We have excellent dossiers on all of them. Most are in banking, business, and industry. Some are in science, mostly academic, some in the military, a few in politics, a very few in journalism and communications. Which one Schultz would have known, and how well, that will take a little time, but not as long as you might think. The colonel's division has a good file on Schutz himself, up to his disappearance in 1945. It's a matter of matching them up. I'd look for a public figure, Fergus said. Somebody pretty high up who doesn't want a spotlight on his past. There are some of those. They all have spotlights, but refrain from shining them on one another. A sort of mutual let's keep our mouth shut society. Also, Fergus added, someone who can keep him under wraps. because the German public isn't going to welcome Schutz back no matter what. He's got to have a new identity. So you think he's going to defect after all? Mr. Bales said. A week ago we decided he couldn't. A week ago I didn't know about the Steinkampf syndrome. Also, remember we were talking about defecting to us. We hadn't considered the other possibility, going home to Germany. Right now, it's the only sensible conclusion I can think of to what he's been doing. Start at the beginning, which you have just brought with you, the paper from the Berlin Medical Archive. It doesn't tell you much, said the colonel. True, said Fergus, and by not telling much, it gets the story started. He walked to the trestle table and came back with a bulky sheaf of typed pages. A preliminary report, 48 sheets, double-spaced, that's German for preliminary, on materials received March 12, 1937 at the Berlin Laboratory of Applied Biological Sciences from the Bonvulo Medical Expedition to the Andes, signed by Dr. Helmuth Schultz. We know about the expedition. We've read the field report. Helmuth Schultz had read it too, remember? Everything in here is accounted for, labeled, weighed, measured, described in tedious detail: lung tissue, capillary cross-sections, autopsy reports, hemoglobin measurements, dietary analysis, statistics on incidence of pulmonary disease, field microphotographs of tuberculosis, even human fetuses in formaldehyde, and more and more and more. But what about our water samples from the Steinkampf Valley, both in the rubber-stopped, sterile glass containers, containers carried in lined metal boxes, containers labeled 4D17, water from the upper stream intact, pulmonary analysis, ordinary pure mountain water, trace minerals listed, but the container labeled 4D18, water from the lower stream, empty on arrival. Explanation: container insufficiently filled at source. Large air content of bottle causing implosion of rubber stopper at surface atmospheric pressure. Explanation: my foot. Of all the items brought back, more than 2,000, this one alone failed to make it, according to Dr. Schutz. Was anybody else there when he opened this particular crate full of samples? We don't know, but I'll bet there wasn't. It's easy to see how young Schutz, he was still in his late 20s then, would have been intrigued by the Steinkampf village story, both the original adventure of Diaz Rodriguez and the follow-up visit by his German colleagues. He'd be curious about the water, just as we were, but I'm betting he was a lot more excited than that, because he spotted it right away as just possibly the very thing he'd been working on, getting red hot on, a genetic change, a subtle but pervasive one caused by some mutagen in the water. It might have been nothing. He knew that. It could have been a fairy tale contrived by Diaz Rodriguez, or more likely a bit of folklore he had picked up. Or it might have been an example of communal hereditary degeneration brought on by any of 100 cases. Such phenomena are common in isolated mountain communities where there's a lot of inbreeding. Remember the Jukes and the Kallikaks. But two things would have fascinated Schutz. First, the sharp division of the village into two groups along the two waterways. Group A, water source A, remain normal. Group B, water source B, all deteriorate. Second, the nature of the deterioration. No physical debility, but a kind of spiritual decline, a docility, a passive submissiveness, a willingness and eventually a need to take orders. Schutz knew it was a wild dream, but he was a dreamer. I can see him now, opening the crate containing that particular group of specimens. He finds a box labeled 4D-18, opens it, decants the water. There were 500 cc's of it into a sterile bottle of his own, labels it, hides it away. Then he forces the rubber stopper into the empty bottle, where it will be found the next day, rattling around dry as a bone. The loss causes no great stir. It was, after all, a side expedition. He's got what he wants. Now how to test it. He may have tried it on animals first, but I doubt it. How do you check subtle changes in the psyche of a dog or an ape? But just about this time, the Nazis solved this particular problem with their own happy invention, the concentration camp. They liked Schutz, and they were, as we all remember, fascinated with genetics to a point of mania. They gave him a laboratory just outside Berlin, all the human guinea pigs he wanted, and a free hand. They had several broad objectives. They wanted to prove that Aryans, that is, pure Aryans, meaning Germans, were genetically different and superior, and that Jews were just the reverse. But they also wanted to learn about what we now call genetic engineering. Breeding, yes, for super Aryans, but more than that, actual gene manipulations. Schutz went to work on this. He had a staff, he had money, he had equipment. But he kept his little water bottle to himself. We don't know on whom he first tried it or how. Did he administer it by mouth, by injection? However he did it, he got results. They must have been dramatic. At least they were convincing enough that he kept working on it, has kept working on it ever since, and still is. Why didn't he tell his Nazi leaders about his discovery? I can guess at several reasons. Although he was top dog in his own laboratory, he wasn't very high up in the hierarchy, not even in the science end of it. If he came up with anything really hot, they'd have taken it over. Oh, they'd have let him work on it, probably given him a promotion. But it wouldn't be his. Also, he had problems. He didn't really know what he had. What was in the water? Was it a virus, a bacteria, a new chemical mutagen of some kind? Let's say he tried it on 1 or 2 human subjects. Let's say, since we don't know otherwise, that he gave them small doses orally, and that the effects matched Diaz-Rodriguez's, or the old man's, description as at least well enough so he knew he was onto something. The victims changed. They lost their initiative, lost the will to perform independently, but perhaps the dosage was too strong. Maybe they fell into a stupor, some kind of somnambulism, and had to be disposed of. Remember, he didn't want to call attention to them. So there was a problem. Number one, could the doses be regulated? Could he vary the effect from, say, a mild condition of irresponsibility, perhaps rather euphoric, to a total helpless dependency, a trance-like state? Problem number two would quickly have become more urgent, a simple problem, but critical. He just didn't have enough of the water to experiment much further. The original bottle held half a liter, 500 cc's, about a pint. Could he make more or get more? The answer to the second question was no. With the war breaking out, the Germans weren't sending any more medical expeditions to Peru. Even if they wanted to, the Peruvians wouldn't let them in. The solution was to find out what was in the water and see if he could produce more of it. I expect that was Schutz's big research project over the next several months, maybe years. And that part of the story we just have to skip. We don't know how he set about it, what equipment he used, how long it took. He must have kept notes, but we don't have them. My guess is they were destroyed, probably by Schutz himself. But I know how I would have gone about it, and so does the colonel. I'd have used ultracentrifuge, electron microscope, X-ray spectroscopy, bacterial cultures, electrophoresis, and we must assume that one way or another he solved the problem. He found out what was in the water and how to make more of it. When we pick Schutz up again, he's in Novokuznetsk, and he has made a lot of progress. He's in the late stages of a very precise study, how to control the effects of Steinkampf's treatment by varying the dosage. If you take his Group 17 reports and leave out the germ warfare stuff, the meat of the reports, well, to simplify the job, I ended up doing it the other way around. I took scissors and cut out all the digressions. I pasted them up in a notebook of my own, following Schutz's own chronological order. When I had it halfway done, the whole thing became brilliantly clear, and the rest was apple pie. He has 18 case histories going, 18 laboratory subjects, 6 men, 6 women, 6 children, over a period of 11 years. He must have had many more, but we don't have notes on them. On these people, he's doing most careful and elaborate testing. He's giving them a treatment by mouth in an aqueous solution he calls, a little private joke I expect, doxymin, or dioxymin. He tells the Russians that it's a nutrient solution, duly described in a footnote designed to keep up their health in the unhealthy prison environment, but the liquid also contains a dosage of Steinkampf material. That dosage he indicates simply by a number, completely unobtrusive but always there in the in parentheses. The number range from 5 to 20, indicating some unit of quantity that Schultz has worked out. It could be a gram, a milligram, a microgram, or something smaller. It's interesting and horrifying to note that the children get no dosage at all in their daily dioxamin. There is always a 0 in parentheses. They don't need any treatment. All 6 are offspring of the 12 adults. They've inherited the Steinkopf syndrome from their parents. Fergus got up from his chair by the fire, walked to the trestle table, and picked up a black-covered loose-leaf notebook. He handed it to Colonel Attenborough. Here are the 18 case histories, put together as well as I can do it from the material at hand. I've added explanatory notes, some of them just guesswork of my own, to fill in the gaps. Take them with you and study them. You might want to show them to some of your experts at Dietrich. On these 18, he has worked out the final details of the most insidious weapon ever devised, but he needed 2 more things: a real water system of his own where he could try it out with no one watching over his shoulder. So far, you see, he's mixed it in beakers and bottles and hand-fed it to individuals. Now he needs to prove he can feed it to a city or a country. Having this, he needs a 19th victim to test it on, preferably one he can take with him wherever he's going. And that is the end of chapter 20.